There is a photograph taken at Pocantico Hills in the last decade of the 19th century that shows the Rockefeller family gathered on the wide steps of a stone terrace. The father sits in the center, hands folded, his face composed in the way of men who have decided very early that the world will remember them. His son stands a step behind him, thin and formal, already learning the same composure. The daughters are arranged in a soft curve around them, their hair carefully done, their gowns catching the summer light. It is the kind of family portrait that would appear over the next century in 100 books, on the walls of 100 lecture halls, in the introductions of 100 biographies of the first billionaire of the modern world. There is one figure absent from that photograph. She is absent because she is standing just behind the photographer, in the shade of the pergola, with a hand raised to shield her eyes. Her name is Laura Celestia Spelman Rockefeller. In the family, and in this documentary, she is called Cettie. Perhaps she has just said something quiet to arrange her daughters more gracefully. Perhaps she has just decided, without saying it aloud, that the boy at the back should stand a little straighter. She is the reason the group is composed the way it is. And she is the reason the century will remember the family the way it does. The story of the Rockefellers has been told for more than 100 years as a story of men. The father who dismantled the American oil industry and put it back together in his own hand. The son who built a city block in Midtown Manhattan and then gave it his father's name. The grandsons who ran a bank, a foundation, a governor's mansion, and, for a brief and awkward time, the vice presidency of the United States. It is a story of contracts, of testimony, of pipelines, of pledges announced from marble podiums. And it is in a way that has almost never been examined seriously and complete. Behind every one of those men stood a woman whose signature never appeared on any contract, and whose portrait rarely appeared in any newspaper, and whose influence, in the slow, indirect, patient way that women of her class were permitted to have influence, may have shaped what the name Rockefeller came to mean more deeply than the men who bore it. Her name, in the first generation, was Cettie Spelman. This is the story of 3 generations of women who ran an empire without being permitted to say so. Subscribe for more long-form documentaries on the great dynasties of old money, one new episode every week. Laura Celestia Spelman was born in Wadsworth, Ohio, on the 9th of September in 1839, on the same day and in the same year as the man she would eventually marry. It is one of those coincidences that biographers love, and that the Rockefellers themselves, both of them serious Baptists, later interpreted as the quiet proof of a divine hand. Her father, Harvey, was a dry goods merchant who had prospered enough to buy comfortable houses in Akron and then in Cleveland. He was also, and more importantly, an abolitionist. He served in the state legislature. He was active in the Congregational Church. He worked quietly and at some personal risk in the operation of the Underground Railroad, sheltering escaped enslaved men and women on their route to Canada. Her mother, Lucy, was devoted to the cause of temperance and to the practical, unshowy work of the church. Cettie, as she was called at home, absorbed all of it. She absorbed the abolitionism. She absorbed the temperance. She absorbed the church. She absorbed the belief, at once radical and severely disciplined, that life was a matter of duty and that pleasure was, at best, a distraction from what one had been placed on the earth to do. When she stood on the stage of Cleveland's Central High School in the summer of 1855 to deliver the valedictory address of her graduating class, she was not quite 15 years old, and the speech she chose to give was titled, "I Can Paddle My Own Canoe." It was a plea, delivered by a girl of not quite 15, for the right of women to pursue cultural and independent thought. Among the students listening in the audience was a former classmate of hers, a serious, quiet boy her own age named John Davison Rockefeller. They knew each other only slightly then. He was already gone, out of school, working long hours at a produce commission house on the Cleveland docks and keeping meticulous records in a ledger he called Ledger A, which biographers of the family would still be reading a century and a half later. She went east, to the Oriad Institute in Massachusetts, to train as a school teacher. She came back to Cleveland in 1859, tried unsuccessfully to organize a music class, and then took a job as a substitute teacher at the Hudson Street School. Her superiors described her, in the language of the time, as a splendid disciplinarian and a perfect teacher. 2 years later, at 22, she was appointed assistant principal. Her former classmate began to call at the Spelman residence in 1862. Their courtship, as attested by the ledgers into which John Rockefeller entered every penny he spent, was of the kind that would have puzzled almost any other young couple of their generation. They never went to the theater. Cettie considered dancing, in her own careful word, sinful. They read novels and poetry together. They played piano duets. In April of 1864, an entry appeared in the ledger for a diamond ring. They were married on the 8th of September of that year, a day before her 25th birthday, at the Spelman house in Cleveland. Their honeymoon, itemized in the same ledger, included a souvenir pillow purchased at Niagara Falls for the sum of $1.57. The house they bought on their return was next door to his parents'. It was a plain frame house on Cheshire Street. Cettie kept the books, in the early years, at his request. He trusted her arithmetic more than he trusted almost anyone else's. When the refinery deals began to accelerate in the middle 1860s, and the young John Rockefeller began to work the 18-hour days that his biographers would eventually describe as the most economically productive stretch of any single American life of the 19th century, it was to that plain house on Cheshire Street that he came home at night, and it was Cettie who was still awake in the kitchen, keeping his supper warm and reading the Bible by lamplight. Within 6 years of their marriage, the Standard Oil Company existed. Within 20, John Davison Rockefeller was the wealthiest man in the United States. Within 30, according to some contemporary estimates, he was the wealthiest man in the world. Cettie's response to this was to refuse to change. She kept the small Baptist rhythms of the Cleveland years even after the Cleveland years were over. She kept the family life austere. She read the Bible aloud to her children. She insisted that the younger ones wear the older ones' hand-me-downs, and that all of them earn their allowances by pulling weeds in the vegetable garden. When her son John came to her one Christmas with a list of the things he hoped to receive, she remarked to a neighbor, with an equanimity that has become mildly famous in the biographical literature, that she was so glad her son had told her what he wanted for Christmas, because now it could be denied him. She was not unaware of the money. She kept an eye on it in the only way that a 19th century wife of the wealthiest man in America could keep an eye on it, which was through the church and through charity. She and her husband began, from the earliest years of the marriage, to donate a tithe of their income. And when a small Baptist seminary for African American women opened its doors in Atlanta in 1881 and struggled to survive its first years, Cettie's father Harvey and her mother Lucy became its financial rescuers. 3 years later, in 1884, John and Cettie's contribution had grown large enough that the seminary was renamed in honor of her parents. It became Spelman College, and it remains today, 140 years after its founding, the leading historically black women's college in the United States. That is the sort of thing that could not have happened without her. Her husband, for all his cold genius, was a man of a specifically Baptist and specifically Northern white social imagination. She was the daughter of an abolitionist who had personally sheltered escaping slaves on their way to Canada. When she looked at Atlanta, she saw something that her husband would probably not have seen alone. The founders of the seminary, Sophia Packard and Harriet Giles, two New England schoolteachers who had gone south to open a school for the daughters and granddaughters of formerly enslaved women, had held their first classes in the basement of a Baptist church, on old benches without a blackboard, in a room lit by a single window. There was no funding to speak of. There was no building. There was, at first, no name. Cettie and her husband gave the seminary its first serious operating grant in 1882. 2 years later, when the school moved into its own buildings and needed a permanent name, the founders chose to honor, of all the possible benefactors, the family of one of the two women who had made the school's early survival possible. They named it not for John Rockefeller. They named it for Harvey and Lucy Spelman, Cettie's parents. Cettie herself, one is told, considered the honor excessive and asked once whether it might be reconsidered. It was not. The name remained. She raised the 4 surviving children, Bessie, Alta, Edith, and John Jr., under a system of small daily disciplines that she had inherited, more or less unchanged, from her mother. She kept a family ledger in which each child recorded their expenses. She required that they earn their spending money by pulling weeds, by shining shoes, by killing flies in the summer months at a fixed rate per fly. Her son John, in later life, would testify that he never received a shilling from his father as a gift, and every shilling he did earn was entered into an accounting book that his mother reviewed. Her daughters were educated at home, by tutors, and later in small private schools that the family established for their own use and for a handful of friends' children. Her son attended Brown and then went into the family office. He had absorbed, by the time he was 20, not merely the arithmetic of his father's business, but the theological seriousness of his mother's home. He would prove in the second half of his life one of the most consistent religious philanthropists of the American 20th century. He had learned it on the whole from her. There had been a fifth child, Alice, born in 1869, who died of dysentery a little over a year later. She is buried in Cleveland in the plot at Lakeview Cemetery, in the family ground that would eventually receive her mother as well. Her name appears rarely in the surviving family papers. The family moved, as the fortune grew, from Cleveland to a large house on Euclid Avenue, and eventually to a series of houses in Manhattan, and to the estate at Pocantico Hills. Cettie went with them, but she went reluctantly, and she resisted the social world to which her husband's fortune had, quite against her will, entitled her. She had been diagnosed in the mid-1870s with what her doctors at the time called consumption, and her health began to fail slowly and then more quickly as the century turned. From about 1910 onward, she was largely confined to a wheelchair. On the 8th of September in 1914, she and John celebrated their golden wedding anniversary at Pocantico Hills. The children, all but Bessie, who had died 8 years earlier in France, gathered for the anniversary dinner. Her husband, who was not a man given to public tenderness, rose at the table and said, in words that later biographers found preserved in the family record, that he had had but one sweetheart, and that he was thankful to say that he still had her. The next day was her 75th birthday. She died the following spring. Her husband was in Florida with their son when the telegram arrived. The morning of the 12th of March in 1915 was cold at Pocantico Hills. The nurse had brought her a glass of milk. She took it, drank a little of it, and set it down. It was mid-morning when her heart failed her. The funeral 3 days later was small and private. Only the family attended. 3 years afterward, her husband created the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial in her name. He would live for 22 more years and be buried at his own request next to her. She had never sat on the board of Standard Oil. She had never signed a contract. She had never given a public speech in her life after the age of not quite 15. And in a manner that would prove characteristic of the Rockefeller women who came after her, she had shaped the family, the fortune, and the century-long reputation of the name more thoroughly than almost anyone who ever appeared in the newspapers alongside her husband. But Cettie Spelman was not the only woman of the first generation. She had 4 daughters, and each of them, in her own manner, tested the boundaries of what a Rockefeller woman was permitted to be. The eldest was Elizabeth, whom the family called Bessie. She was born in Cleveland in the summer of 1866, when the Standard Oil Company did not yet exist, and she grew up in the transitional decade during which her father was becoming, silently and by degrees, the richest man in America. She was a serious, bookish girl. She attended Vassar College as a special student. In 1893, her father contributed $35,000 toward the construction of the college's first dormitory and asked that it be named Strong Hall in honor of Bessie's married name. She had married 4 years earlier a philosopher and psychologist named Charles Augustus Strong, and she had gone to live with him first in Chicago and then, as his academic career drew him toward the intellectual centers of Europe, in Paris and in the south of France. She had 1 daughter. She had, from a comparatively young age, poor health. She died on the 14th of November in 1906 in Cannes at the age of 40. Her father did not attend the funeral. He had already by then formed the habit that his biographer, Ron Chernow, would later describe as his way of managing loss. He withdrew into his correspondence, into his ledgers, into the running of the estate at Pocantico, and he did not permit himself, in any of the surviving documents, to say what her death had cost him. The second daughter, Alice, born in 1869, lived only slightly more than a year. She is buried at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, beside the mother and father she barely knew. The third daughter, Alta, born in Cleveland in the spring of 1871, chose almost the opposite course from her sister Bessie. Where Bessie had gone toward books and philosophy in Europe, Alta went toward the quieter, more parochial life that her mother had lived. She married a Chicago attorney named Ezra Parmalee Prentice on the 17th of January in 1901, in a ceremony held on the wide landing of the staircase of the family brownstone on West 54th Street. The wedding had originally been planned as an elaborate church affair. It was quietly reduced to a family gathering, weeks before the date, when the family learned that Alta's 4-year-old nephew, John Rockefeller McCormick, the eldest son of her younger sister Edith, had died of scarlet fever at the family estate at Pocantico Hills. Alta and Ezra Prentice had 3 children. They bought 1,400 acres of land near Williamstown in Massachusetts and built a 72-room summer house they called Elm Tree House on what became Mount Hope Farm. In the 1930s and 40s, Ezra employed a rotating team of geneticists to develop hardier strains of cattle and poultry, and Mount Hope became quietly one of the leading experimental agricultural farms in the country. It was a life almost mathematically opposite to that of her younger sister in Chicago. Where Edith kept a jeweled clock beside her plate at dinner and timed each course, Alta kept a farm ledger in the front room and timed the calving. Where Edith sold pearls in her 60s to pay debts, Alta discharged, in 1940, a $14,000 mortgage on Alta House in Cleveland, the settlement house she had founded, at the turn of the century, in the poorest quarter of that city, so that the institution's day-to-day work would not be interrupted by the pressures of the Great Depression. Her own inclination, all her life, was to give quietly and to live simply. She left, in her will, more than $600,000 to hospitals and charitable institutions. She lived longer than any of her siblings, to the age of 91. She died in Manhattan in the summer of 1962, the last surviving of Cettie Spelman's 5 children, and the last human being alive who had personally known the founder of the Standard Oil Company as her father. Her mother's small daily disciplines, one suspects, would have been recognizable in every room of the house at Mount Hope on the morning of her death. The 4th daughter was different. The 4th daughter, whom Chicago society would soon learn to fear and to court and to laugh at and to imitate, was Edith. Edith Rockefeller was born at Pocantico Hills on the 31st of August in 1872. She was, by every account that survives from her childhood, the most intellectually gifted of Cettie's daughters. She played the cello. She learned to read Greek and Latin. She spoke French, German, and Italian by the time she was 20. She was, at the same time, the most temperamentally unlike her mother of any of the daughters. Extravagant where Cettie was thrifty, theatrical where Cettie was quiet, unwilling to accept, at any level of her being, the Baptist proposition that pleasure was a form of moral failure. She married in the autumn of 1895. The man was Harold Fowler McCormick of Chicago, the son of Nettie Fowler McCormick and of Cyrus Hall McCormick, the inventor of the mechanical reaper. The 2 families, in the language of that era's society press, were routinely referred to as the Prince of International Harvester and the Princess of Standard Oil. Their wedding took place quietly, in a parlor of the old Buckingham Hotel in Manhattan. Chicago received them. Chicago, in the 1890s and the early 1900s, was a city of stockyards and steel and railroads, a city built on money that had never particularly cared to be dignified. Edith Rockefeller McCormick set out to dignify it. She and Harold settled into a gray stone mansion at 1000 Lakeshore Drive, with a cone-top tower that Edith called the Bastion. She fed her guests off Napoleonic gold plate. She wore a Cartier necklace, at social occasions, that carried 10 enormous emeralds and more than 1,600 diamonds. Before the opera, she served 35-minute dinners, timing each course by a jeweled clock she kept beside her plate, and allowing the men, when the ladies withdrew, exactly 10 minutes for coffee and cigars. She and Harold, together with a small group of other patrons, founded the Chicago Grand Opera Company in 1910. She donated the land in the same decade that became Chicago's Brookfield Zoo. She built, at Lake Forest on the shore of Lake Michigan, a 44-room Italian villa called Villa Turicum, with grounds designed by Charles Platt. She was, for approximately 15 years, the reigning social sovereign of the second-largest city in the United States. There were also the private tragedies. 2 of her 5 children died young. Her health began to fail. And in 1913, following a period of what her biographers agree was a serious depression, Edith McCormick left Chicago and traveled to Zurich, in Switzerland, to be treated by a psychiatrist whose name almost no one in America had yet heard, Carl Gustav Jung. She stayed 8 years. The story, often repeated in the newspaper columns of the 1920s, holds that on an earlier evening, during a dinner party at the Chicago mansion, on the night her eldest son John died of scarlet fever, Edith received the news whispered to her at the table by a servant, and merely nodded and allowed the party to continue without incident. Whether the story is true or not, her father's biographer Ron Chernow has made clear that it could not have happened that way. At the moment of her son's death, in the spring of 1901, Edith was not in Chicago at all. She was at Pocantico Hills in New York, at the family estate, in the room where her child was dying. A year later, she and Harold founded, in Chicago, the John McCormick Institution for Infectious Diseases, funded in his memory, and it was in that institution that the bacterium responsible for scarlet fever was eventually isolated. Some legends outlive the people they were told about. Others do not deserve to. In Zurich, Edith paid for the translation of Jung's writings into English. She provided a physical location for the psychological club. She funded from her personal income a young Irish writer she had never met, a man named James Joyce. From February of 1918 until October of 1919, during the writing of the novel that would eventually be published as Ulysses. Jung, in time, appointed her an analyst in her own right. She took a practice of more than 50 patients. She translated, she wrote, she read Ida Tarbell's History of the Standard Oil Company, a book which, in every meaningful sense, had been written to destroy her father, and she read it with what her biographer describes as an almost professional detachment. She reached out, in a series of letters that survive in the family archive, to that same father, and told him, in words she had not permitted herself to say aloud in his presence, that there was warmth and love in his heart when one could get through the outside barriers he had built to protect himself from the world. He did not answer that letter in the terms in which it had been written. He was 90, and he had never really thought about his own barriers, and he was not going to start. To practice humility, in the years of her Zurich analysis, she is said to have scrubbed the floor of her hotel room herself. One of her 99 patients over the course of her practice was the man who tended the hotel garden, a plump, quiet Swiss of no particular formal accomplishment, 10 years her junior, named Edwin Kren. She came home in 1921, and Kren came with her. Her husband, who had by then formed an attachment to an opera singer, whose talent for the stage was disputed, but whose ability to command his attention was not, filed for divorce, retained a formidable legal team that included Clarence Darrow, and left. The settlement was ruinous. Edith bought his half of both their houses and assumed the debt. She built in the 1920s a real estate business that developed thousands of acres of affordable middle-class housing in the suburbs of Chicago. And then, in October of 1929, the market broke, and the debt she had taken on to build the business swallowed her. She went to her father for help. He refused. She sold the emeralds. She sold, one at a time, the great pearl necklace that had once been valued at $2 million. She was diagnosed in 1930 with the cancer that would kill her. She died at the Drake Hotel in Chicago on the 25th of August in 1932, 6 days before her 60th birthday. Her funeral in Chicago was attended by thousands. Her father, then 93, was too frail to travel and did not come. He would live another 5 years. She had refused all her life to be what her mother had been. And what she had been instead, a patron of an obscure Swiss psychiatrist, the American underwriter of a European avant-garde, the woman who bought Brookfield Zoo out of her own income and gave it to Chicago, would outlast, in ways that were not obvious at the time, every one of the Cartier necklaces she had sold to survive, which is when a new generation of Rockefeller women began, quietly, to take charge. Abigail Green Aldrich was born in Providence, Rhode Island, on the 26th of October in 1874. She was the fourth child of a family that could not have been less like the Cleveland Rockefellers if it had tried. Her father, Nelson Wilmarth Aldrich, was a Republican senator from Rhode Island, and for most of the last 2 decades of the 19th century, the single most powerful legislator on questions of tariffs and finance in the United States Senate. Her mother, Abigail, was warm, sociable, and interested in everything. The Aldrich house was the kind of house in which Senator Eugene Hale might drop in for tea, and Elizabeth Bacon Custer, the widow of the general, might stay for a weekend. The child growing up in it, the girl who would eventually be called Abby by everyone who knew her, was, by the account of everyone who met her, unusually alert, unusually curious, and unusually inclined to laugh. Her early education came from Quaker governesses. From 1891 until 1893, she attended Miss Abbott's School for Young Ladies in Providence, where she studied English composition and literature, French, German, art history, ancient history, gymnastics, and dancing. She made her formal social debut in November of 1893. The following June, at 19, she sailed for Liverpool on the first of what would become a lifetime of European travels. Her first continental tour included England, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and France. A 5-country curriculum in the appreciation of European art, delivered directly into the eye of a young woman who had already, in Providence, developed a serious interest in the paintings she was about to see in person. She met John Davison Rockefeller Jr. in Providence in 1894, when he was a sophomore at Brown University and she was 19. The courtship, in a pattern that had already become a Rockefeller specialty, was long, restrained, and heavily supervised. It lasted 5 years. They were married in a lavish ceremony at the Aldrich house on Warwick Neck on the 9th of October in 1901, when she was almost 27. His wedding present to her was a sum of money. She promptly, in the first gesture of what would become a lifelong pattern, donated the entire sum to the Providence branch of the Young Women's Christian Association. The Rockefellers she was marrying into were not the Rockefellers of Providence society. They were the Rockefellers of a house on West 54th Street in Manhattan and of a growing estate at Pocantico Hills. And they were, at the time she joined them, the most publicly detested family in the United States. Her new mother-in-law, Cettie, was already bedridden, or nearly so, and would spend the last 6 years of Abby's marriage in a wheelchair. Her new father-in-law was a stranger to European travel, a stranger to modern painting, a stranger to the sort of large, laughing, politically networked household in which the young Abby Aldrich had grown up. The transition from Providence to Pocantico was, in temperamental terms, more foreign than her actual transition from Providence to Paris had been. She managed it in the early years, mainly by refusing to be observably impressed. Her father-in-law was under investigation. Her father-in-law would soon be more so, and would remain for the rest of his working life the near-universal object of American reformist rage. Her husband, the only son, had inherited the family's specific gift for public discomfort, along with a temperament his own biographers would eventually describe as adoring but obsessively jealous. He needed his wife in a way that was almost unmanageable. He resented anything, including their own children, that diverted her attention from him. She managed him with an intelligence that has never been fully credited. She kept him. She loved him. She read to him at night when he was worried. She wrote him letters in the years he was traveling on Rockefeller Foundation business that biographers have described as extraordinary. She raised their 6 children, a daughter and 5 sons, born between 1903 and 1915, with an emotional openness that was, for a Rockefeller household of the period, revolutionary. She wrote to those children when they were old enough to receive letters of their own about matters that women of her class did not, as a rule, write about. In one letter preserved in the family archive and addressed to her older sons, she observed, with a directness that has since been quoted repeatedly by historians of American philanthropy, that the social ostracism of the Jews, though less barbaric than the treatment of other minorities she had seen in her own country, caused cruel injustice, and that she longed to have their family stand firmly for what was best and highest in life. If the older boys would do it, she wrote, the younger would follow. It is not a sentence one expects from a socialite. It is one gradually comes to realize exactly the kind of sentence Abby Aldrich Rockefeller was in the habit of writing. And she found, at the same time, the room she needed for the ideas that were her own. Her public work began through the YWCA from 1918 through 1936. She was in constant active service on the national board of the organization. She was elected chair in 1918 of the Housing Committee of the War Work Council, an organization founded during the First World War to improve living conditions for working women. Under her direction, the committee built the Grace Dodge Hotel in Washington, one of the country's earliest and most influential residential hotels for professional women. In 1919, she turned her attention to the immigrant workers at the Bayway refinery of the Standard Oil Company in Elizabeth, New Jersey, men and women whose lives depended on the fortune her husband had inherited. Her husband bought 6 lots of land in Bayway and deeded them to her. On that land, she built first a model workers' cottage, and then, over the following 20 years, a community center with clinics, a nursery school, a gymnasium, and a bowling alley. By 1943, 4,000 families were making use of the center. Her personal contributions to its operation over a 20-year period amounted to something like $200,000. She did all this, one should note, while raising 6 children in a household whose head genuinely believed that his wife's first attention belonged to him. She did it, one should further note, while being described by every single one of the men who wrote about her as a socialite. The word carried, and still carries, a specific dismissive weight. It is a word that suggests she attended parties, which she did. The word does not suggest that she personally financed a nursery school in New Jersey for the children of Standard Oil refinery workers, which she also did. There was one other project, and it was the project by which she would eventually be remembered. And it was the project that quietly severed her, on one particular question, from the husband who otherwise adored her. By the middle 1920s, Abby Rockefeller had become deeply, seriously, professionally interested in modern art. Her husband did not share the interest. He had inherited from a father whose taste in decorative objects had been formed in the 1860s, a firm and unshakable conviction that art of any consequence had ended somewhere in the 19th century, and that the movements which had followed, the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, the entire proliferation of what he considered ugly experimentation, were an aesthetic mistake, and possibly a moral one. Junior loved Chinese porcelains. He loved medieval tapestries. He loved paintings by the old masters. He did not love Van Gogh, did not love Seurat, did not love Matisse, did not love Picasso, and did not particularly want, in his own opinion, his wife loving them either. She loved them anyway. She began collecting in 1925. She used for these purchases what she called her Aldrich money, the smaller personal fortune she had inherited from her father, over which her husband did not have absolute control, and she hid what she bought. In their 8-story mansion at 10 West 54th Street in Manhattan, at that moment the tallest private residence in the city, she took the room on the 7th floor that had originally been the children's playroom, now empty because the children had grown, and she converted it into a private gallery. Onto its walls she hung the Van Goghs, the Seurats, the Matisse, the Cézannes, the Toulouse-Lautrecs, the Picassos. Junior almost never went to the 7th floor. He did not need to know what was there. Her son Nelson did know. He was 22 years old in 1930. He had grown up watching his mother study catalogs at the breakfast table. He had grown up watching her come home from Manhattan galleries with brown paper parcels which she carried herself up 7 flights of stairs rather than trust to a servant. When in later life he tried to describe her, he described her attraction to what he called the unusual, the adventurous, the inner-directed art. She liked experimentation, he said. She was open to new ideas. She wanted to understand, above all, the art that her children would grow up to understand. In other words, she wanted to be a modern. Modernity in art was not, at any point in his life, John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s forte. In the summer of 1929, at a lunch in Manhattan, Abby Rockefeller sat down with 2 friends, Lily Bliss, another modernist collector of remarkable seriousness, and Mary Sullivan, and they agreed among themselves that the city of New York should have a museum devoted to the modern movement in art. The idea was audacious. There was no such museum in the United States. There had never been. The 3 women found a 4th ally, A. Conger Goodyear, who agreed to chair the founding committee. And in November of that year, 1 month after the Wall Street crash of 1929, at very nearly the worst moment in the century, financially speaking, to open a museum, the Museum of Modern Art received its first visitors in 6 rented rooms of the Heckscher Building on 5th Avenue. She was one of its 3 founding trustees. She was, in the private judgment of her biographer, Bernice Kurt, the persistent force behind the museum's survival. She gave prints. She gave paintings. She gave, when necessary, cash. She gave what her son, Nelson, would eventually inherit as an obsession of his own, and would eventually bring, as chair of the museum's board, to a scale nobody in 1929 could have imagined. The first exhibition, Cézanne, Gauguin, Seurat, Van Gogh, opened in the Heckscher Building on the 9th of November, 10 days after the Wall Street collapse of that October. Nobody in the New York art world seriously believed a modern museum could survive the coming winter. Abby's committee had leased the 6 rooms for a single year. They opened the door on the first day expecting few visitors. In the first month, 47,000 people came through. In the first year, the number was more than 150,000. The lease was renewed. It has, in a manner of speaking, been renewed continuously for the following 97 years. Junior did not visit for years. When he finally did, he was polite. Then he began slowly to give money. It was one of the quiet ways she had of persuading him. In 1936, she prevailed on him to give the museum its first formal purchase funds. 2 years later, in 1938, she prevailed on him to give more, and their son Nelson matched the gift again, in her name. The Mrs. John D. Rockefeller Jr. Purchase Fund, unrestricted as to what it might acquire, quietly became one of the foundational instruments by which the museum built out its permanent collection. Lily Bliss died of cancer in 1931. less than 2 years after the museum opened. Her will included a bequest of 150 artworks to MoMA. Mary Sullivan drifted out of the day-to-day work in the years that followed. Abby stayed. She stayed on the board. She stayed on the executive committee. She continued to buy. She continued to give. Between her personal purchases and her donations, she assembled what the museum's own historians describe as one of the founding collections of the entire institution. She died of a heart attack on the 5th of April in 1948 at the family apartment at 740 Park Avenue in Manhattan. She was 73 years old. Her will directed 4 particular paintings to the Museum of Modern Art, 2 by Georges Seurat, 2 by Vincent van Gogh, and the residue of her estate, after taxes, to the same institution. She left, in addition, 1,600 prints to the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller print room, which would open at MoMA the following year. She left the entirety of her collection of American folk art to Colonial Williamsburg, where the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Center was opened in 1957 to house it. She had been called, all her life, a socialite. What she left behind was the founding donation of the most important museum of 20th century art in the United States, a nursery school for immigrant refinery children in New Jersey, the Grace Dodge Hotel for working women in Washington, the Folk Art Center at Williamsburg, and 6 children, Babs, John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David Owen, every one of whom would go on to spend some part of their adult lives trying, in their different ways, to be the kind of person she had modeled for them. Her husband, who lived 12 years longer, spent much of that time asking Henri Matisse, then bedridden in the south of France, to design a stained glass window for the church at Pocantico Hills in Abby's memory. Matisse initially refused. Nelson Rockefeller sent him photographs of the church. Matisse changed his mind. On the 1st of November in 1954, he wrote to say that he had finished the window. He died 2 days later. It was the last work he ever made. That is what a Rockefeller woman looked like in the second generation. She hid modern paintings on the 7th floor because her husband did not want to see them, and she quietly financed a museum that would eventually put those same paintings on public walls for the rest of the century. She did it, so far as anyone could tell from the outside, without ever raising her voice. And in the third generation, the pattern quietly continued. Abby Rockefeller Mosé, the eldest child and only daughter of Abby Aldrich and John Jr., was born in Manhattan on the 9th of November in 1903. She was known within the family from earliest childhood as Babs, a nickname invented specifically to distinguish her from her mother. She grew up in the shadow of 5 brothers who were being groomed one after another for public prominence, and she made an early, quiet, deliberate decision not to be groomed for anything of the sort. She attended the Burley School and Miss Chapin's School, both in Manhattan. She married 3 times. Her first husband, David Milton, a lawyer, gave her 2 daughters. That marriage ended in 1943. Her second husband, a neurologist, died in 1949. Her third husband, Jean Mosé, an executive at United States Trust Company, was the one whose name she carried for the rest of her life. Where her brothers built foundations, ran campaigns, and gave speeches, Babs gave money without letting anybody photograph her doing it. She sat on the board of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. She sat for years on the advisory board of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where she and her brother Lawrence were among the largest single donors of the mid-century. In 1965, the hospital gave her its Medal of Appreciation. Almost no photograph of the ceremony survives. Her most characteristic act was small, geographically speaking, and enormous in every other way. In 1968, she created a foundation called Greenacre, of which she was president, whose stated purpose was to maintain and operate 1 or more small parks in the city of New York for the benefit of the public. In 1971, that foundation opened Greenacre Park, a tiny, deep, 3-tiered garden on 51st Street in Manhattan, with a 25-foot waterfall running down one wall and a canopy of honey locust trees overhead. She had commissioned it, in her own words, to give New Yorkers some moments of serenity in this busy world. Her brother Lawrence, a trustee of the foundation, helped bring it into being. She was a member at the same time of the Board of Trustees of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and an honorary trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation itself. In the manner of women who had grown up watching their mother work quietly in a family of men who worked loudly, she conducted these responsibilities in the tone in which she conducted everything else. When she declined a public interview, it was without commentary. When she made a large gift, it was without a press release. She died at her Manhattan apartment on Beekman Place on the 27th of May in 1976. She was 72 years old. Greenacre Park is still open. It receives every summer some of the largest per square foot traffic of any public space on the island of Manhattan. Almost none of the people who sit on its benches, listening to the waterfall drown out the traffic, know that it exists because a daughter of the Rockefeller family, in her 60s, decided that Midtown Manhattan needed a quiet room outdoors. There was one more woman in the third generation whose work reshaped the country in ways that are still being tallied. Her name was Margaret McGrath, but she was known, from very early in her life, as Peggy. She was born in the year the Great War entered its second summer, on the 28th of September, to Francis and Neva McGrath of Mount Kisco, New York. She was educated at the Rippewam School in Bedford, at the Shipley School in Bryn Mawr, and at the Chapin School in Manhattan, a route that placed her, by her late teens, in more or less the same tight social circuit as the youngest son of Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. She met David Rockefeller in the middle 1930s. She married him at Bedford, New York in 1940. They had 6 children over the following 12 years. David Rockefeller went on to become chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, one of the most traveled private citizens of the 20th century, and the last of the 6 children of Abby and Junior to survive into the 21st. Peggy went on to become something almost nobody had expected her to become. She became a farmer. She began raising cattle in the 1970s, on the family's summer property at Seal Harbor, on Bartlett Island in Maine, and then on land at Pocantico Hills, and eventually on a working farm in Columbia County in New York State. She bred Simmental cattle. She won prizes. She learned and used all the practical machinery of the American farm. She was seen by staff, by neighbors, by the occasional visiting journalist who was driving her own tractor in overalls, at dawn on a stretch of coastal Maine that had been the private property of one of the wealthiest families in America since her father-in-law had bought it. When guests came out from New York for the weekend, she cooked. When they left, she went back to the barn. And in 1970, having observed the accelerating conversion of Maine's coastline into second-home real estate, she founded with a small group of collaborators, an organization called the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, whose purpose was to buy up threatened stretches of shoreline and place them in permanent conservation. It was the first regional land trust of its kind in the United States. 10 years later, in 1980, she went national. She founded, again with a small group of collaborators, the American Farmland Trust, whose stated purpose was to slow the paving over of American agricultural land. It is now the largest organization of its kind in the country. She was, all this time, the wife of the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. She attended state dinners. She hosted heads of state at the family estate. She served for 17 years as a trustee of the New York Philharmonic. She raised, on the side, $500,000 for a 6-volume series of books on the wildflowers of America. There is one small episode from the spring of 1961 that captures, better than any general description, the way she moved through the world. She and David had gone to Paris on bank business. John D. Rockefeller Jr., David's father, had died a few months earlier, and the 6 adult children were looking for an artist of appropriate stature to design a stained glass window for the Little Union Church at Pocantico Hills, where their father had worshipped, and where their mother Abby was already commemorated by a rose window Henri Matisse had made in the last month of his life. While David sat through his meetings, Peggy walked to the Louvre. There, in the temporary exhibition halls, she found the 12 stained glass windows Marc Chagall had designed for the Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem. She stood in front of them for a long time. Then she went back to the hotel, and she told David that she had found the artist. He went to look the next day. He agreed. He wrote to Chagall. The Good Samaritan window at Union Church, dedicated to the memory of Junior, was designed by Marc Chagall as a direct consequence of Peggy McGrath's walk to the Louvre on an afternoon in 1961 when nobody was watching her. When she died of cancer at a New York hospital on the 26th of March in 1996, David Rockefeller made a gift of $1 million to the New York Botanical Garden to restore a 2-acre rose garden originally designed by Beatrix Ferrand in 1916. It reopened as the Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden, and it remains 30 years later one of the most visited gardens in the city. The pastor of the Union Church at Pocantico Hills approached David in the year of her death and offered to dedicate one of the Chagall side windows to Peggy's memory. David chose the window based on the image of the prophet Ezekiel in luminous blue, reaching up to accept a scroll from an angel. Behind every one of the Rockefeller men, in 3 generations, there had been a woman whose signature never appeared on a contract. Let us go back for a moment to the photograph. It is still there. It is still on the wide stone terrace at Pocantico Hills in the last decade of the 19th century. The father is still in the center. The son is still standing behind him. The daughters are still arranged in a soft curve around them. And the photographer is still, of course, invisible, as photographers always are. And the woman standing quietly behind him, shielding her eyes from the summer sun, is still absent from the frame. But look at it now, knowing what we know. The father, who is at the center of the composition, had come to the arrangement of that particular household from a childhood shaped by an itinerant father of doubtful character and a devout, exhausted mother. The version of family life he permitted himself as an adult, the daily Bible readings, the hand-me-downs, the tithing, the seminary in Atlanta that grew into Spelman College, was not, at heart, his invention. It was his wife's. He had absorbed it from her, gradually, over the 50 years of a marriage that neither of them had ever seriously considered breaking. His public reputation as the coldest capitalist of the American century, and his private reputation as one of the most consistent religious philanthropists of the same century, were not two contradictory faces of the same man. They were the two faces of a marriage, and the second face was hers. The son, who is standing behind him, would grow up to build Rockefeller Center in the middle of Manhattan, and to restore colonial Williamsburg, and to donate the land beneath the headquarters of the United Nations. He would do all of it, all of his life, in a mood of moral seriousness that had been shaped by his mother. And he would do it in the second half of his life, alongside a wife whom he loved possessively, and who nonetheless quietly built, in a converted playroom on the 7th floor of their home, the collection that founded the Museum of Modern Art. When he finally understood what she had built, he began to fund it himself. The daughters, arranged in a soft curve around them, would go on, the four of them, and the one who had died before she was 2, to lives so various that no single history of the family has ever quite managed to hold them all together. Bessie would die at 40 in the south of France. Alta would live to 91 and endow a settlement house in Cleveland's Little Italy that is still standing. Edith would host Chicago's opera in Zurich's Jung and would die of cancer in a hotel room, having sold her jewels to pay her debts, at 59. And in the generation that came after, Babs would build a small park in Midtown Manhattan for the specific benefit of strangers she would never meet, and Peggy McGrath would save 100 miles of the coastline of Maine. None of them in any generation was ever chair of Standard Oil. None of them was ever president of the Rockefeller Foundation. None of them was ever on the cover of Time magazine in the ordinary course of business. Their names appear in the biographies of their husbands and their brothers and their fathers as footnotes, or as chapter headings that get skipped, or as the small type at the bottom of the caption underneath a family portrait that has been reproduced too many times to draw the reader's careful attention. And yet, the Museum of Modern Art exists, Spelman College exists, the Bayway Community Center in New Jersey exists, Alta House in Cleveland is still standing. The John McCormick Institute isolated the scarlet fever bacterium. Greenacre Park is still a room without a roof in Midtown. The Maine Coast Heritage Trust has, in the 55 years since Peggy Rockefeller founded it, permanently protected some 300,000 acres of the Maine coastline from development. The American Farmland Trust has done, at national scale, work whose full result will not be legible for another generation. The Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden opens every spring at the New York Botanical Garden. Colonial Williamsburg preserves, in one of its historic houses, the folk art collection that Abby Aldrich Rockefeller left it. The Chagall windows at the Union Church at Pocantico still catch the afternoon light on Sundays. None of the women who did those things signed a contract for any of them. Almost none of them ever appeared on a magazine cover for any of them. Some of them, in the way of women of their class and their period, would probably have found the idea of being celebrated in the terms of this documentary embarrassing. Cettie, one suspects, would have found it embarrassing on grounds of Baptist propriety. Abby would have found it embarrassing on grounds of taste. Babs would have found it embarrassing on general principle. They ran a family that is remembered as an empire. They ran it, in some cases against the wishes of the men who technically owned it, and in some cases with those men's grateful cooperation, and in every case without ever standing at the front of the room. They ran it through letters. They ran it through wills. They ran it through the slow, patient, unspectacular decision, made and remade every day, that one particular painting should be bought, that one particular seminary should be funded, That one particular stretch of coastline should not be developed. That one particular midtown block should be given, at least for a few afternoons, back to silence. Some legacies in the end are inherited more for the silence they built than for the noise they made.